Previously on this channel, we began a mini-series covering the first chapter of Formula One's history. From the very birth of motorsport history up to the first season of Formula One in 1950. And today it's time for the second part of this story, which will cover from 1950 to 1970. And as the second part of this mini-series, in this one we'll tell you about the most important changes that led to the category we know today, both in terms of economic regulations and safety. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second part of the history of Formula One, the era from 1950 to 1970. The inaugural season of Formula One was a resounding success, marking the birth of the first ever world championship in motorsport history. Nino Farina and Alfa Romeo dominated the first Formula One season in 1950. The category rapidly became the pinnacle of motorsport, featuring the best cars, drivers, and brands. A year later, in 1951, brands like Alfa Romeo, the champion, Scuderia Ferrari, and Maserati were already registered in the category. As years passed, more brands registered. In the early years, as the category stabilized and sought growth, the technical regulations remained largely unchanged, which was advantageous. And at least the first 5 years of the category would produce a champion. In 51, Juan Manuel Fangio, and in 52 and 53, the Italian Alberto Ascari. And in 54 and 55, Juan Manuel Fangio, who would repeat as champion. The teams had to pay hefty sums just to participate in the category, and income distribution was nearly non-existent in those years. The teams had to race with cars painted in their country's colors, and they weren't allowed to have sponsors that had nothing to do with the automotive world. And above all, safety was practically non-existent. The drivers didn't have seatbelts, the helmets didn't cover the whole head, and they only wore some goggles to protect themselves from the wind. Therefore, it was common for many drivers to die in those early days of the category. In Formula One's first championship stage, there were only 3 distinct rules. The first was that cars using a supercharger could not exceed 1.5 liters of engine displacement, while those without could exceed 3 liters. The second rule stated that engine specs were limited to 1,500 cubic centimeters for supercharged cars and 4,500 for non-supercharged vehicles. And finally, as a rule, each car had to have 2 rear-view mirrors. And these regulations, with the cars that had already been created before the start of Formula One, would remain practically unchanged until 1957. Several events occurred during that time. Several constructors, like Alfa Romeo in 1952, left Formula One due to lack of financial support from their country. Maserati also left Formula One due to high costs, or Mercedes-Benz, which entered Formula One in 1954. And they withdrew a year later as a result of the deadly Le Mans accident in 1955, which caused the German brand to leave competitions for a very long time. And this was a period when many brands were entering or leaving for different reasons. In the first decade of Formula One, Argentine driver Juan Manuel Fangio dominated, winning the seasons in 51, 54, 55, 56, and 57, winning with the brands Alfa Romeo, Maserati, Ferrari, and Mercedes. And to this day, the Argentine is the 3rd driver with the most world titles in the history of the Grand Circus. During that first decade, some small changes were made, such as the reduction of the race distance, which went from 500 kilometers to 300, or the change of fuel, switching from methanol to avgas. But one of the most important changes we had was the birth in 1958 of what we now know as the Constructors' Cup, created with the intention that not only the drivers would be rewarded, but also the teams that built their own vehicles, giving them the same relevance and status as the Drivers' Championship. But definitely the most radical change of that era was when the Cooper team at the 1958 Argentine Grand Prix brought their single-seater, with an innovative mid-engine located behind the driver, which was practically a revolution for the grid, used to mounting the engine in the front of their cars. Surprisingly, Cooper's victory with this engine position system was a first for cars of this style, setting the trend for the future. So that over time, the rear engine became a standard in Formula One, because it became more and more common for cars with the engine in the back to beat those with the engine in the front. This was one of the first great revolutions in Formula One. But starting in the 1960s, even though the technical regulations remained mostly unchanged, in 1961 they tried to reduce the power of the cars to make the category a bit safer. The Formula One engine regulations were adopted, reducing displacement to 1,300 cc and allowing only naturally aspirated engines. In fact, this regulation led to Porsche's brief entry into Formula One for the first time. But during the 1960s, a new dominant force would emerge in Formula One. Quite revolutionary and led by a genius of the top tier of motorsport named Colin Chapman, the owner of Team Lotus. A team born in 1958 which saw the birth of its historic legacy in the 1960s. By 1962, their first great moment of innovation would come as Lotus brought aluminum monocoque chassis to Formula One, which allowed the Lotus car to be a much more rigid and structurally stronger vehicle, which allowed them a leap in competitiveness with which, in 1963, Lotus, led by Colin Chapman and driven by Jim Clark, would win 7 out of the 10 races that year, with both achieving their first titles in the category. Lotus wasn't the sole innovator in this field. They also pioneered aerodynamics in 1968. Wings on single-seaters debuted in Formula One, with Colin Chapman's Lotus 49B being the first to feature them. This would start the aerodynamic revolution within Formula cars, since it was proven that using both front and rear wings allowed the cars to generate downforce and, with that, achieve greater aerodynamic efficiency, increasing performance and improving the speed of the single-seaters. During that 1968, between Ferrari and Lotus, they experimented a lot with the wings, testing different mounts and heights, which led to the famous high wings that quickly became popular. An ideal setup to win by getting the most out of these new wings. Lotus developed these, attaching them to the rear suspensions instead of the chassis or engine. And many teams later started to replicate these wings. Since they tried to give the cars much higher speed in corners, although on straights they made them a bit slower. But the time they gained through the corners completely made up for the loss on the straights. So this trend was the key for Formula One in the development of cars over the next few years. However, with the significant changes in the cars and the expanding calendar, traveling to an increasing number of Grand Prix races across multiple continents. In the year, they started making the costs of the category higher and higher, putting the financial security of the Formula One teams at risk. We have to understand that in those early years, there was no one to sell television rights to and make astronomical amounts of money from it. The teams had to put money from their own pockets to participate, which they only got back through the fees that each Grand Prix paid to the teams. However, a crucial factor significantly restricted the economy of the Grand Circus. And the thing is, the International Automobile Federation had a rule that did not allow teams to have sponsors that had nothing to do with motorsports or automobiles. So in those years, seeing beer brands, computer companies, or energy drinks was not allowed. And the teams couldn't experiment with their liveries, which had to be in the colors of the country they represented as Constructors. This changed in 1968 when Formula One lost British Petroleum as a sponsor. And that allowed the regulatory change that would let teams seek financial support from any brand they needed. That's when Colin Chapman and Lotus once again became pioneers and revolutionaries. Because they specifically sought support from a tobacco brand, Imperial Tobacco, which was looking to advertise its new line called Gold Leaf, which, without knowing it at the time, revolutionized the world of sponsors in Formula racing because the tobacco brand would pay obscene amounts of money back then to Lotus, and Lotus would carry advertising for these companies on their cars. Which ended up being a win-win business for both parties because Colin Chapman got a lot of money for Lotus, pulling it out of the crisis it was in at that time. And Imperial Tobacco got a global showcase within Formula One, which boosted the sales of those cigarettes for a few years. As I mentioned, this partnership was a resounding success for both parties, marking the beginning of the glorious era for tobacco companies. In Formula One, a long-lasting relationship generated millions for the teams. And that, in the end, would be the first pillar of what would become the economic revolution that Formula One was going to undergo in the coming years. What were, generally speaking, the most important changes that took place within Formula One from 1950 to 1970? But as a general summary of what happened in those years, in terms of champions, here we are going to give you a short list of those who became champions during those seasons. In the Drivers' Championship in 1950, it was Giuseppe Farina. In 51, 54, 55, 56, and 57, it was the Argentine Juan Manuel Fangio. Mike Horton was champion in 1958. Jack Brabham was champion in 1959, 1960, and 1966. Phil Hill, the first world champion from the United States, achieved it in 1961. Graham Hill won the crowns in 1962 and 1968 and 1968. Jim Clark was champion in 1963, 1965, and 1968. John Surtees in 1964. In 1967, New Zealander Dennis Hume was champion. Jackie Stewart won his first crown in 1969 and in 1970. The champion was Jochen Rindt. While in the Constructors standings, Van Waal was champion in 1958. Cooper managed to win the championship in 59 and 60. Ferrari won championships in 1961 and 1964, while British Racing Motors took the title in 1962. Brabant would dominate Formula One in 1966 and 1967. The Matra team was champion in the year 1969, and the greatest monarch of this era was the Lotus team, conquering Formula One in 1963, 1965, 1968, and 1970. With this information, we conclude the second part of this mini-series on the history of Formula One, and the next chapter covers from 1970 to the 1990s. So, at least for now, ladies and gentlemen, this story will continue.